For weeks I had watched my wife come home late, her excuses rehearsed and her smile strained. She spoke of office deadlines, of last-minute errands, of friends needing her time, but something in her eyes betrayed the truth. Suspicion gnawed at me until one night I decided to follow her. My heart pounded as I trailed her car out of the city, headlights leading me toward the outskirts where neon signs glowed against the dark. She pulled into a run-down motel, a place where no respectable reason could exist for her to be. I parked a distance away, my chest tight with dread. As I approached the hallway, I froze when I saw the door open. The man who greeted her was not a stranger. It was my own brother. The shock nearly buckled my knees. The woman I had trusted for years and the man I had grown up with stood together in a place meant for secrets. I pressed myself against the wall, my phone in hand, recording without a sound. What I heard inside tore apart more than my marriage. Their whispers spoke not only of betrayal but of calculated destruction. They laughed about liquidating parts of my company, using the money to cover my brother's gambling debts. They spoke of drafting claims that I was financially controlling, a tactic to tilt divorce proceedings in their favor. Every word was poison, every sentence a knife. I wanted to burst in, to scream, to strike back, but I forced myself still. If I revealed my knowledge too soon, they would bury their tracks. So I swallowed the fire in my chest, wore the mask of a man still blind, and walked away with my first piece of evidence. That night, everything I thought I knew about loyalty and love collapsed, but it was also the night I began preparing for war. When I got back home that night, I sat alone in the car with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen as if it carried the weight of my entire life. My fingers trembled as I pressed play. The voices spilled out into the silence of the garage, my wife's low whisper mixing with the deeper tone of my own brother. At first, I thought hearing it a second time might dull the sting, but it only drove the knife deeper. Every word felt like an insult to the years I had given them. Margaret's voice, once soft and familiar, carried an edge that made her sound like a stranger. She was not speaking as a wife, she was speaking as an accomplice, and my brother James sounded nothing like the boy I had grown up protecting. His voice was confident, manipulative, filled with the arrogance of a man who thought he had found the perfect scheme. They spoke about me as if I were already gone, as if the foundation of my life had already crumbled beneath me. They listed accounts, properties, and projects with clinical detachment, calculating what could be liquidated quickly, what could be disguised, what could be siphoned away under the cover of legitimate business. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. They named a company I had never heard of before, some shell corporation set up quietly in another state. Transfers had already been made. My money, my work, my sacrifices, slipping away into shadows while I sat at home believing in loyalty. I grabbed a notepad and began writing down every date and figure I could catch. I paused the recording again and again, replaying sections until I could match their words to my own memories. A late-night meeting Margaret had claimed was for charity work matched perfectly with a large withdrawal from one of our joint accounts. A weekend James had told me he was visiting a friend lined up with a suspicious wire transfer. They thought they had been clever, but the timeline was clear to me now. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was mathematical. Numbers that should have built security for my family were being rerouted into debts I had never created. James's gambling problems, the whispers I had ignored for years, now stood exposed. My wife had not only known but had chosen to join him, to feed his addiction with the fortune I had built. Listening to their laughter, to the way they mocked my trust, I realized this was not some impulsive mistake. This had been planned for months, maybe years. They spoke of me as a target, not a man. They treated my business as a carcass to be stripped clean, not as the life's work of someone who had spent decades building from nothing. When the recording ended, I sat in the darkness, my notepad filled with dates, times, account names, and fragments of conversation. My hands shook, but not from fear. The fear had burned away, leaving behind something sharper. This tape had rewritten not only my marriage, but my blood ties. I could no longer look at Margaret as my wife or James as my brother. They were conspirators, partners in betrayal, enemies who had worn the mask of family for too long. I leaned back in the seat and stared at the ceiling, breathing slowly until the pounding in my chest settled. The recording was more than evidence. It was a map. Every phrase gave me direction, every lie pointed to the truth, Every number led me closer to the center of their scheme. I had spent my life managing projects, coordinating schedules, keeping track of details most men ignored. Now those same skills would be turned against the two people who had believed me too trusting to ever notice. The tape was no longer just a reminder of betrayal. It was my blueprint. They thought I would crumble under the weight of their lies, but I had already begun to mark the cracks in their plan, and I would make sure those cracks split wide open. The morning after I listened to the recording, I stood at the kitchen counter, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Margaret came in humming softly, dressed neatly for work, her hair pinned back the way she knew I liked. She leaned over and kissed me on the cheek as if nothing in the world had changed. And maybe, for her, nothing had. She believed the mask she wore was still enough. What she did not know was that I had already decided to wear one of my own. Long night. She asked lightly, opening the refrigerator. I forced a small smile and shrugged. Just paperwork, you know how it is. She nodded and poured herself juice, her movements casual, but I caught the way her eyes flicked toward me, studying me, searching for cracks in my calm. That was when I realized the most dangerous thing I could do was reveal suspicion too early, if she knew what I had heard. She and James would bury their trail so deep that even I could not uncover it. So I chose to pretend. Pretending was harder than I imagined. Every time she touched my hand or called me darling, bile rose in my throat. Every time she left for her supposed office meetings, I had to smile and wish her luck, knowing she was running into the arms of my own brother. But I held it all inside, storing every look, every word, every excuse in the vault of my memory. That weekend, James came by the house. He greeted me with the same grin he had worn since childhood, though I now saw it for what it was, arrogance. We sat on the porch with beers, and he asked about my company's new projects. He framed it as idle curiosity, but his questions were pointed. "How much did you land on that municipal contract again?" he asked too casually. "And are you still handling payroll yourself, or do you have someone else managing it now?" I laughed, pretending not to notice the trap. "Same as always," I said, keeping my answers vague. He nodded, satisfied, and changed the subject, but I wrote down every word later that night. The mask gave me cover. As long as they believed I was blind, they would keep revealing themselves. Margaret grew bold too. At dinner she asked me about investments, questions she had never cared about before. "Do you think the rental properties are worth keeping long-term, or should we consider selling while the market's hot?" she asked, twirling her fork in her pasta. I smiled, gave her a non-committal answer, and pretended not to notice the way she glanced at her phone seconds later. I imagined James waiting on the other end of a message, hungry for my response. Pretending ignorance was like swallowing poison, but it gave me time. I watched how Margaret moved through the house, what papers she touched, what drawers she opened. I noticed when she lingered by my office, when she accidentally picked up documents that had nothing to do with her. Each time I made a note, each slip was a clue. At night, lying beside her, I forced my breathing to remain even while her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Sometimes she would get up, whispering into the hallway, claiming it was a friend or a coworker in need. I knew better. My chest burned, but I stayed still, the mask never slipping. In business, I had learned that patience often decides victory. The man who rushes to strike first often leaves himself open. The one who waits, who gathers, who plans, always comes out stronger. That was the lesson I carried with me now. Margaret and James thought they were circling closer to their win. They thought the husband and brother they betrayed was too trusting to notice. But every laugh, every false smile, every word spoken too quickly became ammunition in my hands. The mask they believed was weakness was in truth my greatest weapon. They had no idea that every day I wore it, I grew closer to tearing their lives apart. The mask bought me time, but time alone would not protect what I had built. I needed proof, not just of whispered betrayal, but of the money they were siphoning from beneath my nose. Numbers do not lie. They tell the story that people try to hide, and I had spent a lifetime reading numbers more closely than most men read words. I began with our joint accounts. On the surface, they looked ordinary: grocery stores, utility bills, insurance payments. But when I slowed down and compared months side by side, patterns emerged. Larger withdrawals clustered around weekends when Margaret claimed to be at retreats. Transfers appeared late at night, small enough not to raise automatic alerts but steady enough to add up. My pen scratched across the page as I listed each one, building a timeline that lined up almost perfectly with the dates I remembered from the recording. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. A separate account surfaced, one I had never known existed. It was linked to an obscure company name that meant nothing to me at first glance. When I pulled the thread further, I discovered the company was a shell, incorporated just months earlier in a different state. The listed manager was no stranger. It was James, my brother. He had not even bothered to hide behind a proxy. My wife's name appeared too, buried in secondary paperwork, disguised as an advisor. It was bold, reckless, and insulting. I printed everything, highlighting amounts and dates, stacking the evidence until the pile grew thick. Each page was another brick in the wall they were building against me, but in my hands those same bricks became weapons. The more I saw, the more certain I became that their betrayal was not spur of the moment. It was systematic. They had been draining me for nearly a year, feeding James's gambling debts and stockpiling resources for their escape. At night, when Margaret was asleep, I crept into her study. Drawers that once held recipes and stationery now contained neatly filed receipts from boutiques, spas, and restaurants I had never visited. I matched them to account withdrawals. One night she had told me she was comforting a sick friend. The same evening, $1,000 had vanished into a restaurant bill signed by both her and James. The signatures might as well have been confessions. I could feel the anger rising as I uncovered each detail, but anger would not help me. I forced myself to treat this as I would a failing project, identify the problem, trace the source, reinforce the foundation. Every discrepancy became a data point. Every hidden transfer became evidence. I laid them out across my desk, row after row, until the truth stared back at me in black and white. The hardest moment came when I reviewed a transfer tied to our daughter's college fund. That account had always been sacred. I had guarded it fiercely, ensuring she would never worry about tuition or rent. Now I saw that even her future had not been safe from their greed. Several $1,000s had been pulled out, rerouted through the shell company, and lost to James's debts. My stomach turned. It was one thing to betray me. It was another to steal from the child we had both sworn to protect. By the end of the week, my office looked like an investigator's headquarters. Statements covered the desk, receipts pinned to cork boards, sticky notes marking patterns. I had built a forensic map of betrayal that connected every late night, every excuse, every lie. Margaret thought she was clever. James thought he was untouchable, but their arrogance had left a trail wide enough for anyone willing to follow. I leaned back in my chair one night, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. The mask still sat firmly on my face, but inside I felt something shifting. Betrayal no longer consumed me. What replaced it was focus. I had the proof I needed, not just whispers in the dark, not just suspicions, but hard evidence, and evidence has power. It speaks louder than tears, stronger than lies, and clearer than any performance in a courtroom. I closed the last folder and whispered to myself, now the numbers will tell the story. The evidence I gathered was enough to keep me awake at night, but evidence alone could not stop the bleeding. If Margaret and James already had their hooks in my accounts, then every day I waited meant more risk, more stolen money, more damage that might never be repaired. I knew I had to act. But if I struck too loudly, they would accuse me of paranoia or worse, and try to twist it into proof of control. The answer was to move quietly, to seal the gates in a way that looked like ordinary prudence rather than counterattack. My first call was to Marcus Webb, the accountant who had been with me since the early days of my company. I told him enough to make him understand, but not so much that he would panic. "Marcus, I need to review asset protection," I said. He hesitated for only a moment before replying. "It sounds like you need a firewall between your personal life and your business. Let's set that up immediately." Within hours, he had drawn up papers that moved company holdings into structures Margaret and James would not be able to touch. Next came the bank. Tom Bradley, the president of First National, had known me for years. We had shaken hands over loans, stood side by side at charity events, and even shared rounds of golf. When I asked for a private meeting, he welcomed me into his office with the same steady confidence he had always shown. I slid a folder across the desk containing account numbers, credit lines, and joint cards. "I want every one of these secured," I said. Tom studied my face, then asked no questions. He signed the forms himself. From that moment on, any attempt at access required in-person verification, photo ID, and secondary confirmation. By the end of that day, Margaret's access was already shrinking. Her credit cards failed at the club. A withdrawal attempt flagged as suspicious and was blocked. I waited for the call, and it came before dinner. "Alan, something's wrong with the accounts," she said. Her voice sharpened by embarrassment. My card was declined. I made my voice calm and confused. "That's odd. I'll call Tom in the morning. Must be a glitch." She accepted the lie, but I knew panic had already seated itself in her chest. James reacted even more explosively. My investigator told me he tried 3 times to withdraw from the Shell Company account, only to find it frozen. He called the bank, demanded explanations, threatened lawsuits. The clerks described him as red-faced, furious, shouting about his rights. For a lawyer who prided himself on control, the cracks in his mask were beginning to show. At home, I played the part of the oblivious husband. Margaret tiptoed around the subject, testing my reactions, looking for signs that I suspected. I smiled, cooked dinner, asked about her day, and watched her fumble with half-answers. Inside, I felt the shift. For weeks I had been prey, hiding behind masks and recording whispers. Now the tables were turning. Locking the gate was more than financial protection. It was psychological warfare. Margaret and James had believed I was blind, that they could drain accounts and funnel assets without resistance. Now every attempt reminded them that someone had beaten them to the punch. Each failed transaction was a message written in bold: "You are not in control." I walked through the house that night with a steadier step. The pictures on the walls no longer mocked me. The silence no longer pressed down on my chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt ahead of them. My fortress was sealed. The wealth I had built was out of their reach. Margaret believed she was cornering me. James believed he had already won. Neither of them realized that the gates they had planned to storm had already been locked, the walls reinforced, and the ground beneath them shifting. They thought they had set the stage. What they did not know was that I had already written the next act. Once the gates were locked, I knew the next step was not survival, but strategy. A man who only defends himself will eventually lose. To win, I needed to transform grief into a weapon. My office became my war room. By day it still looked like a businessman's study, but by night it turned into the headquarters of my private campaign. I dragged a corkboard onto the wall and filled it with notes. At the center I pinned a photograph of Margaret and James together, a reminder of why I was doing this. Around it I spread documents, receipts, and timelines like pieces on a chessboard. Red threads stretched across dates and accounts, linking Margaret's excuses to James's debts, connecting late-night meetings to suspicious withdrawals. It was not enough to know they betrayed me. I needed to see the whole battlefield. Every square foot of the wall became a map. On the left I tracked assets, properties, accounts, business holdings, investments. Each was marked green for secured or red for vulnerable. In the center I charted the timeline of their conspiracy, a calendar of deceit that stretched back almost a year. On the right I listed their weaknesses: James's gambling addiction, Margaret's vanity purchases, the Shell Company registered under their names. Each was a pressure point I could press when the time came. I called in my most trusted advisor, Marcus the accountant, and my attorney, James Morrison. They were the only 2 men I allowed into the war room. Marcus confirmed that the financial firewall I had built was holding. Morrison, calm as ever, told me to think like a prosecutor. "Evidence is only powerful if you arrange it in a way no judge can ignore," he said. "Stack it so the weight crushes them." So I stacked. Exhibit A was the recording, the foundation stone of the case. Exhibit B was the money trail, highlighted withdrawals and transfers into the Shell Company. Exhibit C was the luxury receipts signed by Margaret and James. Exhibit D was the record of missing funds from our daughter's college account. Exhibit E would be the testimony of people who had seen Margaret spend freely for decades. Piece by piece, the case was being built, not just to defend me, but to destroy the false image they would try to present. The hardest part of building the war room was forcing myself to stay calm. Some nights I would stare at Margaret sleeping in our bed and imagine pinning her lies to the wall beside the others. Other nights I wanted to drive to James's house, throw the evidence on his table, and watch his smug expression collapse. But that would ruin everything. The war room was teaching me patience. Victory would come not from anger but from strategy. I also began writing out questions. If Margaret claimed I controlled her finances, what would I ask her under oath? If James denied gambling, what records could I produce to contradict him? Each question became a trap, each trap tied to evidence I already possessed. They thought they were writing a narrative where I was the villain, but I was drafting a script that would expose them line by line. By the end of the week, the war room no longer frightened me. It steadied me. For weeks I had been consumed by grief, but now grief had become fuel. I was not the victim anymore. I was the general preparing for battle, and Margaret and James were walking straight into the ambush I had designed. One night, I stood in the center of the room. Surrounded by documents, threads, and lists, the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock. I realized I no longer feared their lies. I had already built the truth strong enough to withstand them. In the war room, I was not a betrayed husband or a wounded brother. I was the architect of their downfall. For weeks I had lived as if surrounded by enemies in my own home. Every smile Margaret offered felt like a blade concealed in silk. Every word James spoke sounded like the whisper of betrayal. I thought I was utterly alone, waging a secret war against the two people who should have been my closest family. Then out of nowhere, an ally stepped into the shadows of my battle, someone I never expected. It started with a phone call late one evening. I almost ignored it, but the name flashing across the screen made me pause. It was Anna, my sister-in-law, James's wife. We had spoken rarely over the years, mostly polite greetings during family gatherings. Her voice was tense, almost trembling, when she said, "Alan, I think we need to talk. It's about James and Margaret." My heart pounded as I listened. She had grown suspicious of his disappearances, of money that vanished from their household, of the strange way Margaret always seemed to know when James would be out late. At first she thought it was another woman, but then she found receipts, just like I had, hotel rooms, dinners, and transfers that made no sense. "I do not know the full truth," she admitted, "but I know enough to realize they are working together. And I am tired of pretending not to see it." Her words cut through me. I had imagined myself the only one keeping notes, the only one drawing lines between receipts and lies. Yet here she was, confessing she had been keeping her own quiet record. I asked her to meet me, and she agreed. The next day we sat across from each other in a quiet coffee shop, two betrayed spouses piecing together the fragments of our lives. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of James's gambling debts, letters from creditors, even screenshots of messages where Margaret reassured him that Alan would never suspect. I felt both fury and relief as I turned the pages. Fury at the depth of their arrogance, relief at the undeniable proof that my war room was not built on imagination alone. Anna's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. I stayed silent too long, thinking maybe he would stop. Maybe she would come to her senses, but they have crossed a line. They are planning to burn you down, and they do not care if I burn with you. I leaned back, staring at her. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw someone who understood. She was not just James's wife anymore. She was a witness, a partner in truth. We were both casualties of the same betrayal. That night I also noticed something different in Brianna, my daughter. She had been watching her mother closely. Asking questions Margaret brushed aside too quickly. At dinner she asked, "Mom, why were you asking about the rental contracts yesterday? You never cared before." Margaret's fork froze midair before she forced a laugh. I caught Brianna's eyes, and for a moment I knew she too had begun to sense the cracks. It was a dangerous balance. I could not tell Brianna everything yet, but I encouraged her questions, planting seeds of awareness. She deserved the truth in time. And when it came, I wanted her to see that her father had fought not with fists, but with patience and evidence. Between Anna's documents and Brianna's growing intuition, I realized I was not standing alone anymore. My war room was no longer just a private fortress. It was now a network, however fragile, of people who saw through the lies. Their betrayal had spread so wide that it had created its own witnesses. As I pinned Anna's evidence onto the wall beside my own, I felt something shift inside me. The isolation that had nearly broken me was gone. They thought they had isolated me, trapped me in grief. Instead, their greed had built the first cracks in their own walls. In every war, alliances decide victory. I had just found mine. By the time Anna shared her files and Brianna began asking questions, I knew the pieces were in place. I had evidence, allies, and a war room filled with proof. But evidence alone was not enough. To truly see their conspiracy unravel, I needed to press on their weaknesses. Apply pressure until the cracks widened and watch them betray themselves in their panic. I started small, a subtle adjustment here, a quiet shift there. I had Marcus reroute certain accounts so that funds Margaret had grown comfortable accessing suddenly required dual authorization. Within days she tried to pay for a shopping spree only to be told the card was frozen. Her voice cracked with irritation when she called me at the office. "Alan, the bank is acting ridiculous again. Can you fix it?" I played my role perfectly, sighing as if confused, promising to look into it, but I did nothing. I let her feel the walls closing in. James was even easier to provoke. His gambling debts had grown, and I had made sure his usual lifelines were cut off. The bank flagged his shell company account, forcing him to answer uncomfortable questions. Witnesses told me he stormed out of the branch, slamming the door, face red with rage. The man who once smirked like he owned the world now looked like a cornered rat. The tension began to show between them. Margaret snapped at James during a family barbecue, her voice sharp enough for others to notice. I watched from the porch, sipping my drink, pretending not to hear, while their whispered argument carried in the summer air. Later, Anna texted me, saying James had returned home furious, shouting about how Margaret was slipping and that Alan was starting to notice. I smiled quietly. The pressure was working. At home, I carefully added to her unease. I left certain documents out on my desk, pages half-marked as though I had been reviewing them. Not the incriminating ones, but enough to plant doubt in her mind. One evening I caught her in my office, staring at the papers. She jumped when she saw me in the doorway. I gave her a warm smile, kissed her on the forehead, and asked if she wanted tea. She nodded nervously, her eyes flickering with the kind of guilt that only comes from someone waiting to be exposed. James began calling more often, pressing her with questions she struggled to answer. She tried to cover, but their cracks widened with every failed transaction, every canceled card, every time I played dumb. They had expected me to stumble, to rage, to show my hand. Instead, I offered nothing but patience and kindness, and it drove them mad. Then I moved to the next layer. Through quiet channels, I let whispers of James's debts reach the ears of a few business acquaintances. Nothing too obvious, just enough for him to feel the sting of suspicion. Invitations began to dry up. His so-called friends grew hesitant to back him. Margaret felt it too when she noticed fewer wives welcoming her at luncheons. Reputation was another currency they had taken for granted, and now it was slipping away. At night, the house filled with small signs of her unraveling. Margaret's hands shook when she poured wine. She paced the hallway longer before bed, phone clutched in her hand, whispering arguments she thought I could not hear. Once I caught her crying in the bathroom, though she quickly composed herself when she saw me. I pretended not to notice, but inside I recorded every detail. The beauty of pressure is that it requires no direct confrontation. It is silent, invisible, and relentless. I did not have to accuse or shout. All I had to do was close one door after another until their world shrank into a corner. The more I withdrew, the louder they panicked. The more I smiled, the more certain they became that disaster was around the corner. By the end of that month, I had not only gathered evidence, but also watched their partnership begin to fracture. Margaret doubted James. James raged against Margaret. Both of them looked over their shoulders, wondering how much I really knew, and the truth was simple. I knew everything. By now, I understood Margaret and James well enough to predict their next move. They had already drained money, they had already tried to isolate me, and when both of those failed, they would weaponize the story. They would claim I was the controlling husband, the domineering figure who kept Margaret trapped under financial chains. James would play the role of the noble rescuer, the brother who stepped in to defend her against my tyranny. It was the only card they had left to play, and I knew they were preparing to use it, so I built my defense before their accusations ever saw the light of day. I went back through years of text messages, emails, and call logs. I gathered every record that showed Margaret had not only shared control of finances, but had often been the one making choices. Screenshots of her approving investments. Emails where she insisted on purchases. Messages where she reminded me to move money for our daughter's tuition. These were not the records of a silenced woman. They were the receipts of a partner fully involved. I also collected proof of her spending habits, not to humiliate her, but to dismantle the claim that she was financially starved. High-end boutiques, spa retreats, international vacations, all tied directly to her signature. if she claimed poverty under my rule. The truth would reveal indulgence, not deprivation. James's role was just as easy to unravel. I obtained records of his debts, proof that he had leaned on Margaret as much as she leaned on him. They were not saviors of each other. They were co-conspirators feeding from the same trough. I reached out to friends and colleagues who had seen our marriage up close. I asked them for written statements about how we lived, what they had witnessed. Some recalled Margaret boasting about her freedom, her choices, her spending power. Others remembered James bragging about high-stakes poker nights, the same debts I had now traced. These testimonies would not only balance the courtroom, but also shift the story before it was even told. The irony was that while they prepared to cast me as an abuser, their very actions revealed who the real manipulators were. Margaret had lied to my face, using affection as camouflage. James had stolen with a grin, justifying every betrayal with charm. They were the ones who controlled narratives, not me. I simply decided to gather the raw evidence that spoke louder than their rehearsed lines. At home, I noticed Margaret rehearsing, speaking softly in front of the mirror, practicing tears. I passed by once, and she quickly wiped her face, pretending to adjust her blouse. James, on the other hand, grew more aggressive, telling her over the phone that the victim angle will win everything. I recorded the call with Anna's help. Another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. The key to preemption is timing. I did not release the evidence yet. I kept it sealed, layered, waiting. But I made sure hints of my preparedness reached their ears. A lawyer friend casually mentioned to James that I had been seen compiling binders. Margaret's social circle began whispering about documents she might have signed without care. Every whisper was a shadow that unsettled them, making them doubt the strength of their narrative even before it began. In the war room, I stacked the binders neatly, each one labeled communications, expenditures, debts, testimonies. They were not just collections of paper. They were shields strong enough to withstand the blows I knew were coming. I ran my hands over the spines of those binders and felt, for the first time, an unshakable calm. If Margaret and James tried to claim I was the villain, they would find their playbook already burned. I had not only anticipated their script, I had rewritten it. The day of the hearing arrived like the slow toll of a clock I had been listening to for months. Margaret walked into the courtroom dressed in muted colors, her hair tied back, face carefully composed to carry the weight of a victim. James followed close behind, jaw tight, his briefcase clutched like a weapon. They looked rehearsed, every glance between them filled with silent coordination. For a moment I almost admired their performance, but then I remembered the tape, the withdrawals. The betrayal carved into every page of my war room. My sympathy vanished. When their lawyer stood to speak, I heard the story I had predicted word for word. Margaret was the silenced wife, denied access, deprived of freedom. James, the loyal brother, had only tried to protect her from my tyranny. They painted me as a controlling husband and ruthless businessman, a man who manipulated money to keep power. I sat still, hands folded, expression calm. Every sentence they spoke was a step deeper into the trap I had prepared. My attorney rose slowly, a binder in each hand. His voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of a man carrying undeniable truth. He began with the recording. The courtroom grew quiet as Margaret's whisper and James's confident tone spilled from the speakers. Their scheme unfolded in their own voices. The shell company, the plan to liquidate assets, the intent to frame me with financial abuse. I did not need to look at the judge to know the impact. The shift in the room was immediate. Next came the financial records, transfers tied directly to their names, receipts from luxury stores, credit card bills that contradicted every word of deprivation. My attorney stacked them one after another until the pile on our table towered higher than theirs. Each document was not just evidence, but a mirror reflecting the truth they had tried to bury. Then came the testimonies. Friends recalling Margaret boasting about her freedom, witnesses who had seen James at poker tables, Anna's quiet statement about the threats and lies she had endured. The courtroom no longer looked at me with suspicion. They looked at them with disgust. Margaret's mask cracked first. Her hands trembled as she tried to whisper to her lawyer. James clenched his jaw so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. Their attorney shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his notes as though searching for an escape route, but there was none. When the judge finally spoke, the words landed like a gavel long before the official strike. The accusations against me were dismissed. The petition Margaret and James had filed collapsed under the weight of their own deceit. The judge's eyes narrowed as he warned them of perjury and fraud. My lawyer leaned back, satisfied, and I allowed myself the smallest smile. For months I had worn the mask of ignorance, endured their lies, carried the weight of betrayal in silence. Now the silence was broken, not by my anger, but by the truth. The courtroom had become the final stage of the game I had prepared, and the checkmate was complete. When it ended, Margaret refused to meet my eyes. James stormed out, his shoulders hunched, no trace left of the brother I once protected. I remained seated a moment longer, steady, breathing in the cold air of justice. I had not only defended myself, I had dismantled their scheme piece by piece. Until the only thing left standing was the truth. Courtrooms are not about drama or speeches. They are about patience, preparation, and precision. That day, every late night, every note, every thread on my corkboard paid off. They had gambled on lies. I had bet on truth, and truth had won. In the courtroom, the recording and the chain of evidence left no room for doubt. The narrative of victimhood Margaret and James had crafted collapsed under its own weight. Their lawyer, cornered and humiliated, quietly withdrew. The petition they filed was dismissed without hesitation. In that moment, I felt the final thread of their deception snap. I did not celebrate. There was no triumph in watching the ruins of what had once been a marriage and a family. What I felt was release. The chains of suspicion, betrayal, and silence that I had carried for so long finally slipped away. I signed the papers that ended a marriage already rotted from within, and I did it without regret. The company I had built with my own hands remained intact, safeguarded against the claws of greed. The empire they had tried to strip from me stood firm, untouched. James was no longer my brother in anything but blood. That bond had been broken by his own choices, and I drew the boundary that would never again be crossed. Margaret walked out of the courthouse without looking back, her mask shattered. Brianna, my daughter, chose to stand by truth. She told me later she would make her own way, no longer a pawn in anyone's scheme. Her strength gave me hope that the next generation would not inherit the same poison. That night I drove home in a steady rain. The windshield streaked with silver lines. For the first time in years, the silence inside the car was not heavy. It was peace. The road stretched ahead, dark but clear, and I knew it was mine alone to travel. The lies were behind me. The war was over. I was ready to write the next chapter in my own voice, no longer an echo of betrayal, but a man who had reclaimed his life.